Hi everybody. I'm going to continue on with this PowerPoint. Just so you know, I've cut some slides for the sake of making it flow in a video form, but you can still find all of these slides on that same PowerPoint from last week. We're just going to keep on going, picking up where we left off. And so last week we talked about the definition of culture. Today I'm going to focus on ethnocentrism and cultural relativism. Remember, these are technical terms that I'm going to use and define in ways that are slightly different than their common usage. And last week I gave you some definitions of culture. Culture is learned behavior and beliefs, or a complex whole that we acquire by virtue as our role as a member of society. Clifford Geertz frames this as a system of symbols. I was going to have y'all do an exercise on that today, but we're just going to put that off until Thursday, and one of the writing prompts will position you for that conversation. Or you can think about culture as everything you consider normal and natural. This is where the idea that you often see in popular discourse these days of cultural construction comes from. Or social construction. To say something is a social construct means it is symbolic, it is cultural, it is an idea that does not exist by virtue of any kind of biological or physical reality, but rather as a set of social norms and effects. It's something that exists because on a social level we say it does. Now that doesn't make it not real, because our social lives are very much a part of our reality as humans. But it is a different kind of reality than, say, biology or material reality. And so one of the articles y'all read was Bohannon, talking about Shakespeare in the Bush. This is a kind of funny article for a couple of reasons. First of all, because it was written at a time when students were more likely to have read Hamlet in high school, which doesn't seem to be the norm anymore. I honestly didn't get Hamlet when I was a high school and read it, so no judgment there. I just struggled with the language. The other thing that's kind of funny about this article is you have to pay a little bit of attention to the author's voice and some of the subtleties here. What she does in this article, and you might notice it's an older article, and you can see that in many of the kinds of, if you think about that shift that I've mentioned happening in the 80s, you can see how this is prior to that shift. If you can't see it, it'll become more clear as you read more anthropology and you start seeing these patterns a few more times. But what she is doing that does give it a more contemporary feel is she's written herself as a character. So if you think back to Horace Minor's satirical piece on the Nurserima, he doesn't put himself into the text. He never describes himself or uses I statements or things like that. Or if he does, he doesn't do it very much. This is a writing style that creates a particular effect, that it is objective. Now, I'm saying it's an effect, not a reality. It creates the effect that it's objective because we're erasing our own perspective. We're erasing our own understanding or our own experience of how we arrived at this knowledge, right? So it actually isn't objective. If you remember at the beginning of the course, I said everyone has a perspective that we bring into everything we do, including our research. We all have a cultural lens. But that writing style, and it's probably something you learned to do in high school, has the effect of making it can feel convincing. It can feel factual in a way that is 100% a literary technique that social scientists and natural scientists use. Now, Bohannon is using a very different literary technique in the way she writes her research. So she does create herself as a character. And specifically, the character that she creates for herself, the way she writes herself as a researcher, is she represents herself as a dumbass. She kind of blunders through, misunderstands things, and has to figure it out based on all of these miscommunications. This is a really effective writing technique in anthropology. It's actually something I do in my writing too. Because if you represent yourself as a dumbass kind of blundering through social norms that are different than what you're used to, you're actually dramatizing those differences. And you're dramatizing the explanation of why these different beliefs or practices make sense in that social context. You're dramatizing what you've learned through your research. That can be a very useful approach in anthropology, and whether or not you write yourself as a dumbass or not, it does kind of show you a social norm in anthropological writing, which is we actually do use I statements. That idea that I said at the beginning of the class, you should account for my perspective and not try to pretend it doesn't exist, and you should do that for everything you read and all ideas you hear from other professors or anything, right? We should always think when you hear something that's proclaimed as a fact, what are the implicit cultural orientations and beliefs and assumptions underneath these things being proclaimed as facts? That is using I statements, first person writing, totally normal and accepted within anthropology today. Now, one thing we do see here in this article is that Bohannon entered into the field assuming that Shakespeare represented a universal achievement of art on a human level, that Shakespeare, that Hamlet, that this story would resonate as art with all humans, that it was universal. And what she found was it really just wasn't. That assumption was not true. For TIV people in this community to understand, to make sense of this narrative, they actually had to change it. They had to change the story so that it made cultural sense within their worldview. Because Shakespeare is writing from a specifically European and British medieval, or maybe that's not the right word, late medieval, early modern, it's not really my specialization, but sometime in there, writing from that particular set of cultural frameworks and assumptions. And TIV people are operating from different ones. And that goes from anything from, for example, the concept of a ghost, so important in the story, because there's this point where Hamlet, the main character, encounters a ghost, and TIV elders don't have that concept. It's just not an idea in that cultural worldview. So they have to come up with an alternative explanation for what's happening here, and they frame it as an omen. Likewise, the idea of a king, somebody who, or a queen, who taxes a large population and does not have to labor in the fields. That is an alien concept to TIV political structures, in which a leader of the community or a political figure isn't necessarily surviving exclusively on the labor of subjects. Rather, even people in positions of power continue to have to, grow their own food and things like that. So the concept of a king in the Euro-American sense doesn't exist here. The concept of, and marriage, right? That's another good example. In the Hamlet story, the Hamlet is a prince and his father is killed, or at least Hamlet suspects his father was killed by his uncle. And then later, the uncle marries the king's wife, the queen, to become king, right? And so this man, right, the uncle has married his brother's wife. And for Hamlet, that is wrong. That is, it's really upsetting to Hamlet. And TIV elders just think like, well, Hamlet's full of shit here, Because, of course, if your husband dies, you actually need to remarry, because without that marriage partner, you don't have somebody to help you labor in the fields, make all the things you need for your home. You actually need that family unit as a source of labor so you can feed yourself. So the idea that the queen would not marry, that you would not marry after your husband dies, is, for a period of time, is already alien. Now, the idea that you would marry your ex-husband, your deceased husband's brother, is also, that makes a lot of sense to TIV people, because he's a known actor, he's a known element. You're not marrying some random person who might mistreat you. You're marrying somebody who is already in your family, who you already know. You know this person's a good person. You know this family is a good family. So in that kind of way, these factions that Hamlet finds so troubling actually just seem perfectly reasonable within a TIV cultural context. Now this gets us to a larger issue, which is that when you look anthropologically at how different people are across the world and over time, it becomes very difficult to come up with interesting universals. And one way I put this is human universals are universally boring. As I said in previous weeks, it's not that humans have to eat to survive that's interesting. It's all the different ways we eat that's interesting. And so here with TIV elders, we're seeing this moment where our assumptions about what we thought was a universal human phenomenon break down. We end up seeing that the world as it actually is does not fit our assumptions, our preconceived models. And so as anthropologists, often what we are interested in are exactly these kind of particularities. Because you can't really generalize off of human nature when it's not really possible for anyone to know the full scope of human variation. That's just more than one person can fit in their brain or learn in a lifetime. But what we can see is the moments where people's behaviors or their worldview or the way they live challenges our preconceived assumptions. To put this in a more natural scientific kind of language, it helps us disprove our hypotheses about human nature, including our preconceived hypotheses that we didn't even realize we had. Because like so many cultural phenomenon, we assumed it was natural and normal, and we never even had to think about it. Now, before moving on, I just want to give y'all some pro tips. We'll talk about this more after spring break, but this is a little bit of preview. One thing as an anthropologist is I always insist that culture is multiple. Human beings are connected to each other. The very fact that you can learn anything about TIV worldview is already a function of TIV people being connected to the larger world, to the point where a anthropologist from the United States is able to go spend time interacting and learning from them. All human beings are connected. We aren't culturally isolated. And in fact, the way we live is very much a function of those interconnections. You can't really understand our behaviors or our worldviews unless you make sense of how we fit into that larger global world. I'm going to hit that point because it's really important over and over and over again this semester. By the end of the class, you will have a clear sense of what I'm going on about here. One trick I use that I'm going to encourage y'all to do is I tend to avoid using culture as a noun. I'm more likely to use it as an adjective. Now the trick here, what that does is that if you use culture as an adjective, it becomes grammatically impossible in English to talk about, for example, this culture versus that culture, TIV culture versus American culture, for example. Right? Instead, we have to talk about our cultural beliefs or practices or values. Going back to the article about fatness, right? We can talk about American versus what's the word I'm looking at? I'm looking for American versus Bedouin in Nigeria understandings of fatness, cultural value systems associated with fatness. But we could even go more precise with that, because remember, going back to James Baldwin and Audre Lorde, not all Americans, not all Bedouin people in Nigeria have the same beliefs. We actually disagree. For example, in the United States, there's a lot of discourse about fat phobia and things like that. But, there is a dominant cultural framework. There's a dominant cultural belief about fatness, and that is important to be able to talk about. So when you use culture as an adjective, you get that level of greater precision. You can't even fall back and say, oh, that's just our culture versus their culture. It's like, no, you have to explain it. It's a cultural belief system. It's a cultural ideology or power structure or something along those lines. And so using culture as an adjective will force you to do that. So I'm going to encourage y'all to make that shift over the course of the semester. It's going to be a little tricky at first, because right now when we're building that initial language, you'll see that I do use culture as a noun a lot in these early lesson plans. But by the end of the semester, I'm not going to be doing that anymore, because by that point we'll be at a level of, you'll have a level of knowledge, and we'll have this shared language that will allow me to communicate with y'all with much greater precision. Now let's move on to the conceptual meat of this lecture. These two concepts, ethnocentrism and cultural relativism. Ethnocentrism refers to a practice of evaluating other people's culture based on the standards of your own. So you're applying the values and assumptions and ideas, the frameworks from your own cultural background to another person's. You can think about this, you can break down the etymology here, right? Ethno is a Greek root word. It refers to a culture or a people with certain customs. Centrism, to put at the center. So you are literally putting your own cultural frameworks, your own customs at the center of your understanding. Now, as an anthropologist, I'm not going to say that that is a moral flaw if you are ethnocentric. Often in popular language, ethnocentrism is seen as a kind of moral failing or problem. It makes like it's a bad thing that you're doing. As an anthropologist, I just don't think about it as a good thing or a bad thing. I think about it as an analytical thing, an intellectual strategy, or an intellectual, in this case, flaw. For example, Tiv elders are extremely ethnocentric in this narrative. They are reading a text and they are applying their own cultural frameworks and assumptions onto that text. I don't think that's a bad thing. I don't think they're doing anything wrong. I don't think they're bad for doing that. However, what it does do is it means that they are not engaging in an activity of trying to understand what Shakespeare meant in the cultural context he was writing. They are doing something different than that. If your goal is to understand another person's perspective or cultural background, you cannot do that through an ethnocentric perspective. Ethnocentrism limits, obstructs your ability to understand that person's cultural context. Now, one of the things that's really nice about Bohannon is her writing style. One of the things it dramatizes is that ethnocentrism. Both her own ethnocentrism, right? She creates herself as a very ethnocentric character who is constantly getting frustrated because Tiv people are imposing these assumptions that are different than hers. And Tiv elders are also being ethnocentric in this same process. So again, I don't think that makes either of them bad. but it does obstruct cross-cultural understanding. Now keep in mind, when you read Bohannon, that she's doing this move, she's making this kind of drama. She's writing herself as a dumbass intentionally. So it's important to separate, right? Like she has the perspective of her character, which is a very ethnocentric one, but she's also has her perspective as the author of this article, separate from the character she writes herself as. So that you just be careful when you talk about this article, that you remember to keep those things separate, that Bohannon is intentionally writing herself as a character in a particular way for a particular set of reasons, and that character, who she was when she was doing the field work, is distinct from who she is years later writing this article. And she has different ideas. She actually disagrees with what she used to think. Now, one really nice way of demonstrating that when I talk about ethnocentrism, I don't necessarily mean it's a moral flaw, but an analytical one, comes from the Papineau reading from last week about fatness. In that article, the author, Papineau, talks about how she really struggled to come to terms with Bedouin constructions of fatness as beautiful. Over time, as she studied the society, she was able to make sense of it and understand it, and even start seeing her own body in different ways and becoming more and more okay with gaining weight herself. However, she was never, and she says this in the article, she never was able to fully let go of her own cultural assumptions that she herself should not be fat, that would be bad for her, that would be a negative thing for her. She, even though she intellectually can critique and challenge fat phobia, she still has that deeply internalized cultural perspective that makes it very hard for her. She says she is not able to gain the kind of weight to become as heavy, as fat, as these Bedouin women and still think of herself as beautiful. That's her own limit. Now, that is absolutely ethnocentrism, right? Like, she is stuck in this idea, this particularly cultural construction of fatness as the opposite of beautiful, that is dominant historically in the United States. However, that doesn't make her a bad person, and it doesn't even make her a bad anthropologist in this case, because even though she has this deeply ingrained ethnocentric perspective, she can identify it, she can challenge it, and she can use it as a source of insight. Isn't it interesting that this is her cultural limit? That it's one thing to understand fatness is beautiful for other women, it's another thing to herself to gain a lot of weight and become fat. And that is the limit. Isn't that interesting how deeply ingrained these cultural ideas are and how they affect us? So that doesn't make her a bad person, but as an anthropologist, first of all, we all have these ethnocentric perspectives. We all come into the world with ethnocentrism because we are raised, we think of our own lives, our own cultural frameworks as normal and natural. That is the definition of ethnocentrism. That is what culture is. However, it's a practice of learning to identify those ethnocentric assumptions, to be able to challenge and critique our own preconceived beliefs. And that's what Papineau is doing in that particular example. She's identifying her own perspectives and assumptions. This is very similar to this point that I've been making to y'all at the beginning of class and over again, which is that I come to my work, I come to my teaching, I come to my scholarship with a perspective, and it's more effective to account for my perspective, for my worldview, and how that shapes what I do, than it is to pretend that that perspective doesn't exist, that I am a neutral and unbiased observer with no perspective or stake in the world whatsoever. it's more effective to account for our limits, to account for our perspectives, and to account for our assumptions than to pretend we are not making them. That is a key piece here. Again, doesn't make you bad to be ethnocentric. That just means you grew up in a culture like every other goddamn human on the fucking planet. Oh, hey, that is a universal. Now, cultural relativism is the opposite of ethnocentrism. This idea is the foundation of anthropology. This is one of the big things that come out of Boas's thinking, right? And I've actually explained it to you when we talked about Boas, but now I'm going to give you a term for this idea. Cultural relativism means that the only way to understand a culture or another person's perspective is to understand it on its own terms and in its own social context. You have to ask why these things make sense to the people who are doing them or believing them. You have to say, what are the standards, what are the values, what are the beliefs within this other culture which are different or might be different than my own? So in order to do cultural relativism, you have to think both about your own cultural standards so that you can identify that they are not universal, that they are not normal and natural, as well as the other person's to understand why that behavior makes sense to them. Again, if your goal is to understand another person, you need to take this approach. And what this means is that you have to temporarily suspend your judgment. I'm going to come back to that word temporary, but it's very important. You are temporarily suspending your judgment. You're not saying this other cultural belief is good or bad. That's just not a relevant set of frameworks. That's not a relevant set of questions. Is it good? Is it bad? Is it right? Is it wrong? Do I like it? Do I not like it? None of that's relevant if your goal is to understand another person's perspective. You have to suspend your own judgment so that you can understand them on their own terms. Now, I'm not saying you have to abandon your morals. What I am saying is that you have to temporarily suspend those morals to understand someone. You can come back and still believe the same things later. However, and this will become very clear with the readings for Thursday, often if you do this practice, if you do cultural relativism and you take that temporary suspension of judgment, what you will find is that after you understand these practices in their own social context and you start rethinking, you start applying judgment again, you will find that your judgment will shift, that now you understand the problem in a new and deeper way. Now that is great. So again, like ethnocentrism, for an anthropologist, cultural relativism is not a moral imperative. Being culturally relative doesn't make you a good person. Being ethnocentric doesn't make you a bad person. These are strategies for understanding the world. If your goal is to do anthropology, you need to do it in a culturally relativist way. Now, I'm not saying that it's always going to be your goal to do an anthropology on something, but if that is your goal, this is how you need to do it. So what I'm doing here in part is I'm distinguishing between two ideas that many people often conflate, particularly within public, broader public understandings of culture and multiculturalism. Cultural relativism is not the same thing as moral relativism. I'm saying there's not cultural universals. I'm saying there aren't universal assumptions and beliefs or however you want to frame that. I am saying that it's important to do cultural relativism to understand other people, and that to do that you do have to temporarily suspend your judgment. Now, moral relativism is different. Moral relativism says that we cannot make moral judgments because all moral systems are dependent on the local context. So there's no universal basis. If there is no cultural human nature, or if there aren't universals we can ground our morals on, then all of our morals are relative and you can't impose your morals on anyone else. These are two distinct ideas. And moral relativism is a little messy, right? It's complicated. But I'm going to give you an example to help illustrate this distinction. Let's say you want to do an anthropological research on a group of neo-Nazis. I know whenever you go to neo-Nazis, you've lost the argument, but bear with me because this is a useful kind of example. Let's say you want to understand neo-Nazis in an anthropological way. Now, I'm not saying that you need to do that. I'm not saying we need to understand Nazis on their own terms. You know, my personal belief here, based on my own life experience, including doing anti-fascist work in Charlottesville during the riots as part of the nonviolent direct action contingent. Now, a little bit of a tangent, but I will say, you know, I was in the nonviolent contingent, and we miscalculated, we misunderstood the situation, and if it weren't for the militant people who were there with, like, clubs and body armor, we would have died. But that's another story for another time. Anyway, I think that there are strategic reasons for understanding neo-Nazis in their own terms. Like, I think that is beneficial in some ways. I think it does help us understand certain social problems, but I'm not saying it's everyone's goal at all points in time. I don't think that's healthy or useful. Sometimes our goal is survival. But if you wanted to understand those neo-Nazis, you would absolutely have to suspend your judgment of them. You would have to suspend that judgment, Nazis are bad. Because your goal is to understand why these beliefs, why these ideas, why these organizations make sense to the people within them, why they make sense within a larger social context. You're trying to explain what's going on, why this social phenomenon is happening. If you get stuck saying Nazis are bad and you can't move into a culturally relative space, the only thing you're going to be able to tell me at the end of your research is that Nazis are bad. But I already knew that. I didn't need you to do a whole study to find that. I didn't need you to spend lots and lots of grant money. I mean, it's actually not that much grant money. It's very little to do this kind of work. But you don't need grants. You don't need all that time to tell me Nazis are bad. If you want to teach me something new, you have to do that cultural relativism. Now, afterwards, you've done that project, you've done the research, you might still think, I hope you still think Nazis are bad. That suspension of judgment is temporary. You can bring it back in. I'm not asking you to abandon your moral values. So we have to distinguish between cultural relativism, which is an intellectual approach for understanding difference, from moral relativism, which is about what's right and wrong. When I do a culturally relativist anthropological analysis, I'm not really telling you what's right and wrong. I'm not trying to define that until much later, until I have a deeper understanding. Now, of course, these terms are complicated, and you might think like, oh, well, where do we find the balance of this? Like, okay, so in some cases, moral relativism, that doesn't work, like in the example of the neo-Nazis I just gave you. But in other cases, like, yeah, if human behavior, if human belief systems are all culturally variable, if there is no universal basis to say what's right and wrong, there are no universal morals held by all societies all across time and space, how can we say what's right or wrong? Now, that's a more complicated set of questions that I'm not giving you an answer for. It's a problem, it's a contradiction that you can continue to think through. But my point here is to keep that contradiction in its tension, because if we try to resolve in a black and white way, either there are moral absolutes or everything is relative, we get stuck in a trap. Both of those directions get us stuck in a trap. So, if that's something you want to keep thinking about, there's so much interesting stuff there. How do we balance these kinds of things? Now, one point that students will often make, for example, is like, oh, well, surely there are universal morals. I mean, murder is wrong in all societies, right? No, not at all. in societies where there isn't really a strong state power or state government kind of force, where it isn't able to, like, really entrenched in people's lives, killing is not considered inherently morally wrong. It's hurtful, it can hurt people. But for example, in indigenous societies in the Americas, in the 16, 17, 1800s, it was very common to, if somebody, there was a practice, there was an ingrained cultural practice that if somebody killed another person in your family, you had a responsibility to kill someone in their family to balance out the killing. This is sometimes called revenge killing, although from an insider cultural perspective, it's not only about revenge, it's also, there's kind of a spiritual significance in terms of balancing out the life so that the person who died has a kind of pair. In a lot of indigenous societies, the idea of one is kind of weird and off-putting. Things are better in twos and fours. Relations are really important rather than individual identities at this point in time in this cultural context. Now, this is something that is challenging, it seems wrong, to a lot of Americans today. But one thing that's really interesting is that as a strategy, this approach systematically keeps power from being centralized in the hands of the few. For example, there was a point in the 1700s where the Muskogee Confederacy, which is an indigenous peoples in what later became Georgia, Florida, Alabama, would engage in this kind of revenge killing practice, right? And anyway, in the 1700s, a lot of Creek people who were very wealthy because they were making a lot of money in a plantation-based society, by plantation slave labor in trade with the United States, people who had those alliances, strong alliances within the United States, because in the 1700s, one of the things we see in the Creek Confederacy is the expansion of the gap between classes, between the very wealthy and the very poor. That very wealthy class tried to consolidate their power by instituting a police force. This project fell on its head because nobody in the Creek Confederacy was willing to give up their right to do violence and for that to be considered valuable. It didn't make sense to say, oh, I'm not allowed to do this cultural practice anymore, that this is now wrong, and I have to let the police, these other people, do those things, because that didn't fit. It didn't actually meet the cultural needs. And so the police system was never very effective, because ultimately to live in a society with police, we have to, the phrase that's often used is that the state has a monopoly on legitimate violence. We assume that violence is wrong unless it's the state doing it within a legitimate way with all the proper paperwork. So if the state kills somebody, if the state executes somebody as capital punishment, that is not legally constituted as murder. That's seen as a morally acceptable form of killing. Same with warfare. That is not legally considered moral and is often framed as a morally acceptable or more morally acceptable way of killing someone else. In historical Creek societies, people were not willing to give up their right to legitimate violence. They were not willing to give up that power to a centralized authority. Now, the trick here, what's really funny about this too, is we start to see that even in a very state-driven contemporary U.S. context, killing people is not always considered morally wrong. It's how you kill people. We actually have many ways of killing people that we consider not a form of murder. Whether it's in war, whether it's through things like, sorry, my brain just farted. Whether it's in war, whether it's capital punishment, or whether it's things like people getting lead poisoning because of the drinking water in Flint. That's not considered murder, even though it is a form of killing someone else. When police commit these acts of brutality and kill people, for example, like with the Black Lives Matter movement and protests of police brutality and the killing of black men and black women by police, the question that comes up and that the state has to figure out is this killing on a bureaucratic level going to be considered legitimate or illegitimate? Is this murder or just a killing? And that's where you have this kind of tension that happens in the courts, where you have a lot of people saying, no, this needs to be classified as murder. But that's ultimately a legal question, right? In which we actually have many ways of killing people in this society that's not considered murder. Another great example is regulations that bar access to transgender, gender-affirming care for youth, which many laws across the country are starting to restrict. Now, the context here, the underlying social context that we need to make a culturally relative analysis, is that among non-binary and trans youth, we see one of the highest rates of suicide for any population in the United States. I think there's something like 80% of trans people have attempted suicide in their lives. I am part of that demographic. It's exceedingly routine. Now, the thing is that if you look at the scientific literature, there are really three main interventions that have a positive impact on reducing suicidality among trans and non-binary youth. The first one is acceptance within their family. That's a major, major set of impacts that can either reduce or exacerbate suicidality. The second one is acceptance within your community. Social networks, same thing. The third is access to gender-affirming care. Access to gender-affirming care reduces suicidality significantly. It's one of the three major evidence-based interventions for reducing trans and non-binary suicide rates. So when states restrict access to that care, particularly among youth, because, you know, being a teenager just kind of sucks, and like, for all kinds of reasons, and anyway, when that access to care is restricted, you would predict that without that, we would see an increase in suicide rates. And in fact, studies have found that since these laws have passed, we indeed are seeing an increase in suicide rates within trans and non-binary communities. So this is a systematic, policy level, social level mechanism of killing people in an indirect fashion, right? You put people in a situation, in conditions in which they are statistically more likely to die. Same thing with Flint. People are statistically more likely to die. Now, if you look at UN international law on genocide, that practice does count as genocide. If you create conditions in which a group is less likely to survive as a way of like increasing death rates in that group, that does count as genocide. Now, legally speaking, these policies aren't technically genocide because the UN definition is restricted to like religious, ethnic, and national and religious groups, not gender minorities. That's a limit within the definition. But my point here is, again, we have all of these ways. If students often say, oh, surely murder is a moral human universal. No, it's not. Even in our society, that question of is this legally considered murder versus a legitimate way of killing or an acceptable way of killing, or even a unremarkable, non-noteworthy way of killing people, that's a complicated question. So is it morally right or wrong? There's just not going to be a simple, universal black and white answer. It's always going to be based on the larger context and issues like that. Now, for the next class, you're going to read a classical article by Nancy Shepherd Hughes, an anthropologist studying poverty and infant mortality in a shanty town in Brazil, an informally housed community. So this is a part of a city where people informally construct their own houses and dwellings from materials they have on hand and are able to access. So we're dealing with pretty extreme poverty here. And this is going to represent, Nancy Shepherd Hughes' article is going to represent that kind of post-80s shift. So you'll see a little bit of that, thinking more about interconnections and power and inequalities. This next article is going to be challenging for a lot of y'all on an emotional level, because there's going to be a lot of discussion of children dying and how people adapt to that kind of situation. Your task is going to be to take this thing that is going to be very troubling, and it is very troubling, and do that cultural relativist move. Put aside your value judgments temporarily and try to understand why the practices you're going to read about make sense to the people who do them. Then, once you understand that, come back and see if your value judgments, your sense of what is the ultimate root problem of the situation, what's right and wrong, see if your moral evaluation of it hasn't shifted following that temporary suspension of judgment.